speak. Speak on both cameras. Okay, now.
Like,
Okay, go ahead. Mark it.
okay. Mr. Jordan, thank you for doing the interview for us. I want you to first tell us about growing up in Atlanta in the 40s and 50s. What life was like for a young black man in Atlanta in the 40s and 50s.
You won't believe this, but it was wonderful.
I just need people to know growing up in Atlanta.
Yeah, growing up in Atlanta for me, having been born in 1935, was wonderful. We moved in 1941 to University Homes, the first public housing projects for blacks in this country. Roosevelt came down in 1937 to dedicate the University Homes for black people near the Atlanta University Center, and Techwood Homes for white people over near Georgia Tech. That was a time of real segregation. So the government gave us money for black people in one place and white people in another. But I loved it. I loved the location of University Homes. It was right across the street from Spelman College and Clark College, and just a block away from Atlanta University and Morehouse College, and a few blocks further away from Morris Brown College. I was awestruck by the buildings, by the activities, and as a kid going to the movies on Saturday or going to music practice or piano lesson practice on Thursday, I had to walk through the campuses. And that was an inspirational moment for me to see Dr. James P. Brawley, the president of Clark College, all dressed up and moving about the campus, to see Dr. Rufus Clement, who was president of Atlanta University, who always wore a three-piece suit, and with his vest, that was the Phi Beta Kappa key across it. I can remember coming from the Ashby Street Theater on a Saturday and spotting Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays walking across campus, and 20 feet behind him, I tried to walk like Benjamin Mays. And that had a huge impact on me. There were institutions in my life growing up in Atlanta that were so important to me. The first was my family. Secondly was my church, St. Paul AME Church. I walked to Sunday school with my father every Sunday morning. My schools, Walker Street School, Edmund Asa Ware Elementary School, and David E. Howard High School. And then there was the Butler Street Colored YMCA. That was where I learned to speak in public, where I learned to box, where I learned to swim, where I learned to compete. The Butler Street YMCA was a fundamental institution in my life as a kid, as was the Gate City Day Nursery, two institutions supported by the then Community Chest, which is now United Way. In addition to those institutions were the teachers in the schools and the counselors at the Butler Street Y. They encouraged me, they inspired me, they pushed me, they pulled me. And I have, to this day, remained awestruck by the meaning of those institutions, all within the black community. I did not worry that I was not on the other side of town. because everything was sufficient. And that's despite the fact that when I was in high school, 1951, I used a plain geometry book that had been used by a white student in 1935. Despite the fact that the per pupil expenditure for white kids in the Atlanta public school system was $4 per teacher, per student, and $1 for us black kids. All of those disadvantages were there, but thanks to my parents and their direction and their counsel, we did the best we could with what we had.
What do you remember about John Wesley Dobbs and his importance to the Atlanta black community?
Well, I knew from my time at the YMCA that John Wesley Dobbs was a very important man. He was the co-chair with Austin Thomas Walden of the Atlanta Negro Voters League. And while I was at the YMCA, on Saturdays I would be invited to A.T. Walden's law office next door to fold the letters and put them in the envelopes for the political endorsements of the Atlanta Negro Voters League. John Wesley Dobbs would come to my high school, David E. Howard, which was directly across the street from where he lived on Houston Street. And he was a great orator, and he would come and speak without any notes, and he gave us poetry that he had memorized, and he was a great speaker, and his grandson Maynard inherited that talent.
When and where did you first meet Maynard Jackson?
We went to high school together. We went to high school at the David T. Howard High School. And I think I was a grade ahead of Maynard. We played in the David T. Howard High School band together. Maynard was a trombone player and I was a trumpet player. And that's where it all began.
Well, describe Maynard Jackson back then. What was he like?
The best way to describe him maybe is that in 1951, in the fall, Richard Russell, who was the senator representing Georgia in the United States Senate, and he decided that he was going to seek the Democratic presidential nomination. And the superintendent, Ira Jarrell of the Atlanta public school system, called our principal, Charles Gideons, and said to Mr. Gideons that she wanted the David T. Howard High School band to be at the corner of Peachtree and Baker Streets when Senator Richard B. Russell went up Peachtree Street en route to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And Mr. Gideons told Mr. Days, our bandmaster, and so when we got to band practice, Mr. Days said that we have been asked to play for Richard Russell's parade up Peachtree Street. At which time a trombone player named Maynard Jackson and a trumpet player named Vernon Jordan said, "Hell no, we won't go." And a huge debate took place in the band room as we sat with our instruments about whether or not we would answer the direction given to our principal by the superintendent of schools. And after a huge debate, the practicality that Maynard would ultimately display as mayor of the city led Maynard and I to conclude, after having seen it hell no, we won't go, to say that we have to go so that Mr. Gideon's and Mr. Day's would not lose their jobs. So we played for Richard Russell with our hand-me-down horns and drums. We made good music at Peachtree and Baker Streets. What's important is that 21 years later, Maynard was sworn in as mayor of Atlanta. So he said, hell no, we won't go. But 21 years later, he was the conductor of the political symphony of Atlanta, Georgia.
Great answer. When you and Maynard both left high school and you went off to college, university, and Maynard went to Morehouse, did you guys stay in touch, in contact?
Oh yeah, we were in touch. During our school time, I was away for 7 years, and Maynard there was a program at the Ford Foundation that convinced students and parents who were eligible that they should go to college. It was an early college program. So Maynard he left after the 10th grade. He was in that program. My mother told me I didn't have sense enough to be in the program at that time, and so I stayed and finished. Maynard went to Morehouse, and then he went to North Carolina Central Law School. And I came home in 1960 after I finished law school. I think Maynard came home a little after that. And the rest is sort of history.
So what was your reaction when Maynard decided to run for mayor of the city of Atlanta?
Well, he had run for office before that. He ran for the United States Senate. And I think the elders in the community thought that was a little brazen, as it were. But he ran a beautiful campaign. He learned a lot. He did a lot of teaching in that process. And it helped adjust white Atlanta to what was coming, and that he would be the first mayor, and there's never been a non-white mayor. There's always been a black mayor since, and Andrew Young went to the Congress, and John Lewis, and Horace Ward, and Ben Brown, and Julian Bond went to the state legislature. Leroy Johnson was the first. And so it was moving, and Maynard was a part of that movement because he displayed great courage to want to take on the campaign to be a United States Senator.
Particularly in those times.
Sure.
It took great courage. You know, were you involved in any way when he decided to run for mayor, in his strategy and his campaign?
Now, I was not living in Atlanta at the time. I was in New York as head of the Urban League, but I wrote my check like everybody else.
But you were at the swearing in.
Oh, absolutely. I left New York to go see it. Sometimes seeing is really believing, and so I went to see it, yes.
Take us back to that experience of being there for the swearing in of Maynard Jackson.
Well, given the history of Atlanta, of Georgia, this was an incredible, unbelievable moment. And as his mother held the Bible and as he was sworn in, I slowly felt the tears cruising down my face, and it was a moment of unbelievable disbelief that this was happening in the segregated town and state and area, the South, that we grew up in. And there was no question in my mind, on the other hand, that Maynard was equal to the task.
Let's hold a second. Somebody's phone?
Someone's buzzing.
It's not mine.
Somebody's got a phone buzzing?
Stopped.
No, I still hear it.
I hear it too.
It's like someone's bag.
I don't know.
It stopped.
All right. You still running?
Yeah, still
All
going.
right. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Where were we?
You had the swearing in. You said it was like
Yeah.
a moment.
Yeah, it was just. It was like the night that they declared Obama president. It was, I don't believe this. But it was true and it was real. And we all knew that Maynard was going to be an excellent mayor as he was.
And it's really sort of amazing that, you know, when we think of the 60s, we think of SCLC and the NAACP and Dr. King and Roy Wilkins and all the civil rights struggles that were happening, you know, the Voting Rights Act and all those things that were happening in the 60s and in the 70s. People like Maynard Jackson and Thomas Bradley and Coleman Young, they were working inside the corridors. What was that all about? This sort of change in the sort of dynamic for black people and black people in the
Well,
60s.
the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65, the Housing Act of '68 were the direct result of our own efforts to help ourselves. None of this was volunteered by the nation. It was what government is, a responding entity rather than an enabling entity. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, contrary to what the historians have written, was not written in Washington. It was written on the road from Selma to Montgomery. And what the Congress did was simply to formalize our informality. The law, the heart of it, was written on that road from Selma to Montgomery. So what the United States Congress did was to formalize it by putting the wherefores and the therefores, the periods, the commas, and the semicolon. But the law was written on that road from Selma to Montgomery. And it was government responding to the needs and aspirations of the people.
Maynard comes into office as mayor, and he's very proactive in making sure that, you know, black people who are in the business, they get their piece of the pie. Yeah, that seemed to be really important for the
Well, that was probably the most important thing that he did, was to not just symbolically be the mayor, but to make real his policies to the people. And so he said to the lawyers, you represent the city and you got no black lawyers, so we want some black lawyers. You're doing this for the city as a contractor. We want you to subcontract with this small black business. And he was the mayor. He asked for it, demanded it, and he got it.
Did you guys stay in contact a lot during those years when he was mayor?
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
What were the things you talked about during those times?
Well, it was always whatever issue was at hand. And I remember going to his office in City Hall before I left, when I went down for the inauguration. And there was such joy, and there was such an understanding of the challenge. And it was clear to me that he was more than equal to it.
He's mayor for 2 terms, and you know he deals with the airport building, and he's dealing with the MARTA system, and he's dealing with those Atlanta child murders, and he's always at the forefront of things. And then he steps down, but then he decides to run for a 3rd term. Did he ever ask your counsel when he decided to run again as mayor?
I don't think he sought my counsel particularly. I couldn't even vote in the election. But as I remember, we had some conversations about the 3rd term, and we had many conversations about what he would do after the 3rd term was over.
Can you share some of that?
Well, no, some of it I can't. But it was a question of whether he was going to stay in Atlanta, whether he was going to go do some other things, and he chose to stay in Atlanta and become a businessman. Excuse me.
Do you need water?
I'm okay.
Yeah.
I think.
What was your reaction when Maynard decided to step down after that 3rd term?
It was time
What did you do?
to I believed, and I think he agreed with me, that to everything there was a season, and that season had come, it had been successful, and it was time to do something else. I'll take you up on that water.
Water.
We got some.
Oh, Lee's got it?
Yeah.
It's not in the end.
I just need you to repeat
Not the
that.
sparkling, the flat.
And just say, you know, when
One of
Maynard
those
decides
bottles,
not
too,
to run
would be
for a
cool.
3rd term after you get your water.
Thank you, Lee.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Joe, just again, so when Maynard decided not to seek a 3rd, you know, another term after the 3rd term.
Yeah. When Maynard Jackson decided not to seek another term for mayor, we did and had the conversation that we've always had in our careers, although in different places and doing different things. We had that conversation about what next. And there were a couple of national things that he was interested in, but he was primarily interested in remaining in Atlanta and developing a business, which he did. But we did have that discussion. And there was some talk about the governorship and the Senate again, as I remember. But he ultimately, as we all do, made up his own mind.
He was a great orator, wasn't he? Great speaker.
He was like his grandfather, and like his father, who was a minister at Friendship Baptist Church. And he, like many of us who make speeches, loved the sound of his voice. And that's a quality in a good speaker. You have to like it.
You have to like your voice, huh?
Yeah.
So when was the last time you saw Maynard before he passed away? And do you remember that day?
I do not. I do not remember our last visit. But it was somewhere in Atlanta, talking about something that one of us aspired to do, and how we could be helpful to one another. I was honored to be asked to have a word at his homegoing, and I came home for that. A couple of years ago, I gave the commencement address at North Carolina Central University. And it was at the law school commencement. And I told the story about Maynard and the Richard Russell event that I alluded to earlier, but I also reminded the graduates that in the moot court competition between the University of North Carolina, Duke University, and North Carolina Central University Law Schools, that Maynard beat Duke and the University of North Carolina in the moot court competition. The little segregated school with not nearly the prestige of Duke or the University of North Carolina. When Maynard stood before the judges, he beat them.
He was that good, huh?
He was that good.
Good. What if I had to ask you about Maynard Jackson's legacy to the city of Atlanta, to the United States, what would you say his legacy is?
Well, you're reminded of it. Every time you go through the Atlanta airport, it's now the Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. And it brings back for me, and I'm through there fairly often, the memories of my childhood. I think about John Wesley Dobbs's oratory in my high school or in some church. I think about Maddie Wilder Dobbs singing on the stage. I think of the Dobbs family and their enormous contribution to Atlanta and to the state of Georgia. I think about the Masonic support led by John Wesley Dobbs for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And I'm reminded of the importance, as a kid for me, of the role of the Atlanta Negro Voters League. One Republican, Mr. Dobbs, and one Democrat, Attorney A.T. Walden, led that organization in a bipartisan way. And so I love so much about my hometown, Atlanta, and I'm proud of it in so many ways. So when I land and go to get my shoe shine from guys I played basketball against, and we sit and we talk about Maynard, Andrew, John Lewis. And so I love going home, and it brings it all back.
Makes you feel good, huh?
Absolutely.
So again, I mean, so that's for you, the legacy of Maynard Jackson, of the community of Atlanta for you? That's how you would define Maynard's legacy?
Yeah, well, Maynard's legacy has many dimensions. And it begins with, number one, his political guts, his courage to seek the highest office in the city and win it. And then to be good at being a mayor. That's the ultimate legacy. And he has set the precedent, and he's been followed by 3 black people to be mayor. And hopefully the gentrification that's currently taking place in Atlanta will not change that history now.
So what is it about men like you and Maynard Jackson who came from this segregated community, who aspired to so much and achieved so much? What was it that made you guys, enabled you to do that?
Well, I think that it was the influence of our parents and our grandparents. I think it was the influence of our teachers. I think it was the leadership that we saw in the Atlanta black community. I mean, I grew up in the Butler Street Y, and at 12 years old, I had determined on my own that one day I would speak at the Hungry Club at the Butler Street Y, which was the only integrated gathering in all of the South every Wednesday from September to January. And I went there as a young lawyer to hear Donald Hollowell and Benjamin Elijah Mays and Rufus Clement. And it was a gathering of the black elite talking about issues that affected the community. So for Maynard, for me, for Andrew Young, for John Lewis, for Julian Bond, we were instructed and inspired by these individuals and these institutions. And that's why Atlanta is a great place.
Good. You want to tell us a story about Maynard that no one has ever heard? It'd be wonderful to hear a story about Maynard that no one's ever heard.
No, if I knew it, I wouldn't tell you.
Anything else? I think we got it.
Maybe just ask the question about when did he meet Maynard? Because he just started speaking, I guess, in high school. You didn't open it with the answer.
Oh, if you could just tell us again, I met Maynard, and name the high school that you guys where you met.
Yeah, we were fellow students, Maynard and I, at the David E. Howard High School. It was when Martin Luther King went to that school. It was a junior high school. By the time Maynard and I got there, it was a senior high school. Keep in mind that Booker T. Washington High School was the first high school for blacks in Atlanta, and it came into being about 1923. And for a long time, until the 40s, it was the only high school for blacks in Atlanta. And then in the late 40s, they made David T. Howard High School, which was then a junior high school, a senior high school. And the third high school was Carver High School, which was basically a trade school. And that was what we had in a segregated society. And, you know, we had one Bunsen burner in the chemistry lab. The band instruments were hand-me-downs from the white schools. As I told you, I used a plain geometry book in 1951 that had been used by a white student in 1935. But we, Maynard, and so many of us, did not let that deter us from going to college, going to law school, and coming back home to participate in the leadership and to bring change to our hometown.
Because you all felt it was important to come back home, huh?
We did.
Right.
Now, I came back home and stayed 10 years, and then I left. But my first step was to come back home.
And so it was the same for Maynard. He came back.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Brooke, any questions?
I want to know what kind of guy he was in high school. What kind of young man was he socially?
I'm not going to talk about that. You mean how many girls we took out? I'm not going to talk about that.
How many girlfriends did you have?
Yeah.
Yeah, don't answer.
All right. Let's get some room tone.
Room tone, 30 seconds, please, of quiet. This is room tone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Jordan.
Thank you.
Let's move the mic.
Coming in.
So when
When will you see this?
yeah.
Hopefully in another year.
Hmm.
It'll be done. Production will be done in a year, and it'll be on some place on television or in a festival. You know, and we started interviewing people about a month ago. We interviewed Andy Young and Reverend Lowry and Bunny and the second Mrs. Jackson. And today we interviewed you, and then early this morning we interviewed Reverend Sharpton. And we have a long list of people.
What does Al know about Maynard?
He told a story about when he went to prison and when he was incarcerated for 90 days when he was protesting in Puerto Rico. Maynard came up and brought him a poem that he gave to Al to read. Yeah.
I thought he was a little boy back in those days.
No, this was in 2001.
Yeah.
Stu, you ready to take the microphone?
Yes, sir. I was wondering if you still wanted to continue.
No.
I can take it off.
Oh, I like your cufflinks.
Excuse me, sir.
No.
Can I take a picture of those?
Yeah.
I like cufflinks. Very nice.
It's a nice walk down memory lane.
Okay.
That's right.